Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Yale to all of you, and thank you for joining us for Apollo Luminaries. We hope that you're all staying safe and healthy where you are. My name is Rahim Punja with the Aga Khan Education Board for USA, and I'll be your moderator today. Just a couple of things before we start. For those of you who can see the slides in front of you or see the presentation in front of you, you're more than welcome to follow along. We also just ask that you join the audio, so there should be an option at the bottom for you to join audio by computer or by dial-in. In addition to that, we've got the chat box open for questions that you will have throughout the conversation. All we ask is that you keep the discussion in the chat box for questions, so that way we can monitor that as we're discussing things here today. We'd like to start just by sharing with you a short excerpt from Alena Hazrimam, just to set the tone here. Quote, "There is no better investment that individuals, parents, and the nation can make than an investment in education of the highest possible quality. Such investments are reflected and endure in the formation of the kind of social conscience that our world so desperately needs." End quote. Now, while there may be some varying interpretations of this quote, if I may, I'd like to just highlight a couple of things that always seem to resonate with me here. The first is this notion of education being an investment, that Hazimam refers to the pursuit of education as an investment that, inshallah, will serve the individual, the family, and then the broader community. And then the second element, which is fascinating, is this concept of highest possible quality. And one could say that while quality is indisputable, this view that highest possible quality can vary from person to person. And the underlying guidance here is that each of us aim for what is the highest possible quality for us individually. So with that thought, let's talk about why we're here today. The goal of Apollo Luminaries is to invite you to meet some of the Ismaili college students across the United States as we ask them to reflect back on their high school experience and ask them to share with us some of their learnings and best practices that they utilized and how those decisions and activities and pursuits led to certain outcomes and how we may be able to take away from some of their learnings and their journeys. This discussion is intended for students in middle and high school, but also for their families. But if there are other individuals on this session, you're more than welcome to stay and listen. Additionally, if you have questions during our discussion, as mentioned, please use the chat box for that, and we'll continue to monitor that during this conversation. And then we'll have some time at the end for some Q&A as well. If you're interested, we've got 2 more students who will be featured in the following weeks. So Erman Ismail, who's a student at University of California, Berkeley, and Insha Maknojia, who's a student at Vanderbilt University, will both be talking to us in next Monday and the Monday after. And so we ask that you register for those sessions separately, because if you registered for today's session, that doesn't carry over to next Monday and the following Monday. So for Erman Ismail, you can register at tinyurl.com/springep2. And for Insha Maknojia, you can register at tinyurl.com/springep3. On that note, I'd like to introduce you to Alena Rajwani, who has graciously joined us today. Yale to Alena.
Yale Rahim. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Maybe you can start, Alena, by kicking us off. Take a couple minutes and just introduce yourself to everyone who's listening.
Yeah, sure. So I am born and raised in Dallas, Texas. I attended a large public high school and eventually went on to study at Yale, where I studied political science, and particularly gender minorities and racial minorities and marginalized groups in general. And when I'm not writing papers and doing research, I'm usually doing pottery or playing basketball or reading. And I also worked at Kraft Heinz last summer, where I was working on like the classic mac and cheese blue box team, and I tasted 10 types of mac and cheese every single week. So I have lots of opinions on mac and cheese, and I'm happy to talk about that offline as well.
That's fantastic. Thank you. I actually was in a situation this week where my 6-year-old required us to eat mac and cheese, and we had that for 2 servings, and I was done after that. So I can't imagine what you had to endure during your internship.
Oh yeah, yeah, that sounds great.
Let's start by kind of taking a step back, and we'll kind of time travel here to your high school experience. Maybe you can just start by telling us a little bit about the dynamics of your high school in terms of the size and how that played a role in your overall experience.
Yeah, so I went to a really big public high school, like I said. My graduating class was about, I want to say 550, and I didn't know any of the people sitting 10 people in either direction of me at graduation. So it was a really big school. But what that also meant was that I had a lot of opportunity. So we had tons and tons of AP classes. We had a lot of extracurricular organizations. So I had a lot of opportunity to explore, but at the same time, sometimes it's easy to get lost when you have so many people competing for the same, leadership roles and participation in the same extracurricular activities. So I think I was grateful for the large public school experience, but it really meant that I had to make an extra effort to get my foot in the door and to leave my mark there.
Fantastic. And maybe let's talk a little bit about the types of courses that you took, some of your academic interests while you were in high school.
Right. So like I mentioned, we had a lot of AP courses, and I focused a lot on taking a rigorous course load. So I always tried to take a course load that would be challenging, that would push me to learn better and learn things in a more challenging setting. But at the same time, and being at a school where we had so many APs, it was easy to, just start counting APs and try to rack up the number of APs you've taken and kind of lose the essence of why we take APs, which is the idea of, getting in depth into something that we really are excited about. So I tried to balance taking APs that would look good on my college application, but also that I was interested in. And I think a good example of this is that my senior year, I didn't take an AP science credit. And everyone told me I wasn't going to get into college, so I didn't take a science credit senior year, which was crazy. But I really didn't enjoy science. And instead, I took 2 math classes. And I clearly got into college and things were okay. But that was really my strategy to that, was balancing kind of the rigor and the challenge with classes that I was interested in and not just taking APs for the sake of taking APs.
Yeah, and what would you say about sort of the juggling of the workload and kind of the course load that you were taking, especially in some of the later years in high school?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the course load, I always found it helpful for me to really think about where my time was going in a way that was really intentional. And so I started tutoring pretty early on because I knew that I needed it. As soon as I started falling behind in math a little bit, I got a tutor. I got it early. I tried not to be embarrassed about it because at the end of the day, it was just helping me. And I think that really helped with managing that course load, because I think sometimes we wait too long to ask for help and then it's too late, or it takes a lot more work to kind of improve and to get back to where we need to be. So I definitely say I started a tutor early, and it was definitely the best decision that I made.
Fantastic. Are there things that you sort of did academically that you are thankful for, or kind of looking back, experiences that you had through classes that you felt really sort of cemented some of your curiosities and some of your kind of academic interests overall?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely took a broad approach to my classes, and they covered a lot of different subjects, but I always tried to, I think my academic strategy was always trying to focus more on the learning than the grades, because I truly believe that when you're, out there to learn, that the grades then follow. But when you're chasing the grades, sometimes the learning gets left behind. And this only gets harder as you go through high school, because grades start becoming even more important the closer you get to the college application process. But at the end of the day, the things that, you're able to talk about in your essays and get excited about in your interviews are it's really that knowledge that's going to, pay it forward, rather than just the pure numbers on the report card.
Yeah, that's a fair point. So let's turn now to kind of the second major dimension of high school, which is extracurriculars, right? I mean, for many students, extracurricular activities, either through the high school or through the community, or some combination of the two, take up the lion's share of one's free time. So tell us a little bit about some of your extracurriculars, some of the things that you just did outside of class in general in terms of hobbies and interests. And then how did you start to kind of think about your most significant activities outside of the classroom?
Yeah, so I was involved in primarily the debate team that took up about 40 to 50 hours every week. And I chose that pretty early on. I started my freshman year and I committed to that throughout the 4 years. I was competitive. I competed almost every weekend in the fall, tried to compete at the state and national tournaments in the spring. And it was something that just really drove my high school career. And I think that was but at the same time, like I was really interested in basketball and I played on the team my freshman year. I also really cared about my community outside of school. So I was involved in a lot of Ismaili projects like Camp Mosaic. I did Girl Scouts through Jamaat Kana as well. I went to a lot of SAT prep classes. And if you're from anywhere within like the 50-mile radius of the DFW Metroplex, you've heard of Katy College Prep, and it is the bane of your existence, as it was mine. Those are really some of the things that took up a lot of my time. And, like you said, it's a lot of stuff to do. So how do you kind of balance that? And so for me, like I said, freshman year, I was playing basketball and debate, and it was taking up way too much time, and I wasn't prioritizing either. I was just mediocre at both. And so I had to have a really critical conversation with myself, with my coaches, with my family about how to prioritize my time. And what the conclusion that we came to was I was going nowhere with basketball. I was not going to get like recruited to college because I was primarily warming the bench. And I had a lot better of a future going into debate. And I think at the end of the day, I did quite well in debate, but I had to make that priority shift. I couldn't just keep doing a little bit of everything. I really did have to focus in on one thing. And then I would use my summers to balance my time outside of that. And this meant that because I was involved in so much, I was managing this almost very neurotically, to where I was mapping my day on iCal. Like every hour I was spending, I would map what I was doing. And then at the end of the week, I would total how many hours I was spending on every activity. So I could make sure that I wasn't focusing too much on debate or too much on, SAT prep, or too much on Girl Scouts, just any one activity, because I wanted to balance my faith, my personal passions with my academic passions, and really strike that balance. I don't think it was because I was trying to create this like perfect application for college, but more so for my own mental health, to make sure I wasn't getting too scooped up by one thing and losing the rest of my passions.
Yeah, it's a fair point. And you mentioned kind of the summer component as well. So talk to us a little bit about some of the things that took up your time during the summer.
Right. So the summers are really my time to explore my interest in just community service, because I didn't really have time for that during the school year between school and work and SATs. So summers, I always tried to take on some sort of an independent project, whether that was for my Girl Scout Gold Award, where we built some homes for a few homeless families. The following summer, I was a part of Camp Mosaic, which again, I did Camp Mosaic for almost 4 years consistently, and tried to achieve more leadership positions through that. So I was always trying to like not really one off or just do things once and be done. Like I was really trying to commit, but really that was the time for me to explore those passions and really do the things that I couldn't do in the school year that I could care about. And for me, that was community service. For some people, that's things like baking, writing, but that's really how I spent my summers.
That's great. So if you think about now giving advice to high school students with regards to extracurriculars, a lot of high schools have kind of the extracurricular fairs at the beginning of the year. Sometimes you have students who are exploring activities outside of high school, either through the Jamaat, as you mentioned, or even through their own communities or kind of specific interests that they may have. What would be your general advice about how students go about thinking of their extracurriculars sort of intentionally, but then also strategically?
Yeah, I think it's a balance, right? You want to be competitive for college, but that doesn't define who you are. And often it doesn't even shed, like it's like a fraction of who you are, right? So when you're choosing your extracurriculars, you want to make sure that you're making yourself a better person and not a better applicant. Because at the end of the day, colleges, you can predict maybe where you're going to get in, but not ideally, right? Like you don't know exactly where you're going to go, what you get in. And maybe it'll be that you don't get into your dream school. And so what happens when you don't get in? And you still want to be able to look back at high school and say, I became a better person through my extracurriculars. I've learned so much. And I'm proud of that, rather than, oh, my life was a waste because I didn't get into college, right? So really, and when you're thinking about it, think about your extracurriculars as, does this make me a better person? And that'll inadvertently make you a better applicant, undoubtedly, I think.
Yeah, that's a good point. When I got involved in sort of the college admissions space 10 to 15 years ago, there's a lot of advice around encouraging students to get more involved in their activities and not just get involved, but to sort of start to take on leadership roles, either to kind of aim to become, part of the executive team of an organization. But now the advice has sort of shifted a little bit around, encouraging students to start their own nonprofits, even to launch their own startups. What's your take on this kind of this sort of, shift in in energy and effort that students are kind of being coached to consider?
I think it's the same advice, right? Like I think it's just a different context, but I think the advice in essence is the same, that when you seek those leadership experiences, have the entrepreneurial mindset, right? So when you get a leadership position, it's not you haven't checked off a box, right? Like I said, you want to make yourself a better person. So how do you use that leadership experience to grow your skills, to grow the organization, to make it better? Because colleges, they don't necessarily want kids who are just going to sign up for a bunch of extracurriculars and get leadership positions and keep everything stagnant, right? They're giving to the student. They also want you to give back to their community. So they want to know you're going to come there and you're going to take what they have and make it even better. And the best way to show that is when you have your leadership experiences, make whatever organization you're working in better in some way. And that could be increasing the number of members that you have and running a rigorous marketing campaign, or introducing a new event that your organization hosts. Whatever it is, find something that excites you, and have that entrepreneurial mindset. For some people, that is, like you said, Raheem, doing a startup, but that's a lot. And I don't think it necessarily has to be that big, but I think in essence, it's have the mindset of an entrepreneurial, person. And I think will drive the same advice forward.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, we often talk about sort of things that stand out, and we'll chat a little bit about college applications in a few minutes, but, many students sometimes look for activities that they feel will stand out, right? And there's sort of two thoughts that I have to that. One is activities within the Jamaat. So you mentioned Mosaic and Girl Scouts, but kind of being involved in sort of student-related activities, whether it's youth volunteers. I mean, these are all things that are unique to our community in many ways, and so in some fashion, they can also serve as elements on an application that could be unique to that student's profile. When I talk with students, we talk about REC as being an extracurricular, because technically it's time outside the classroom, right? But it's, not just going in and receiving instruction in REC, but what are you doing with that experience for yourself and then maybe even for others? So I like this suggestion around, taking an entrepreneurial mindset, whether you're doing a startup or even doing something organizationally that can mimic a startup, right? So right. Good points. Let's talk about the current climate, right? So we're in a situation now where everything has shifted to the virtual world. Unfortunately, many of our day-to-day practices and behaviors have had to sort of adjust and be modified. We have a number of families in our Jamaat that are trying to navigate this new world. But what advice do you have for high school students who are currently at home, sheltering in place for the most part? What particular experiences, what particular sort of things can they pursue to round out, the class time that they have and kind of even the free time they have after classes?
This is, an interesting question. Right, we have much more time than we've had before. And what I would say is this is a time to kind of treat it like a summer, to do the things that you wouldn't have time to do in the school year that are really exciting to you. And this is the time that colleges are going to look to see how did you make the most of this, basically this extra summer that you got? Were you pursuing your intellectual passions, your personal passions? And when I say passions, I don't mean like, solving world hunger. I mean, like, maybe you're just excited about making TikToks and you're going to grow your following to 2 million people. And like, that's great. Like, do that, right? I don't think it's about these like big gestures, but it's about like, you're interested in something and you're going to try to explore it. And I think that's the best way to spend this time. I would not be surprised if colleges in the fall were asking, how did you spend your time during quarantine? Like, write me a 250-word essay on it. It seems really reasonable. And you don't want to say that you binge watched 17 shows on Netflix. So, find something that you're excited about, kind of go after it. And it could be anything. I don't think it has to be big, but I think that's definitely key, is even if it's something small, explore your interests in a way that you wouldn't be able to do if you were in school during the academic year.
Yeah, that's great. I know you yourself were not in that situation. There wasn't a pandemic when you were in high school, so it may be hard to advise students today, but I appreciate some of the things that you mentioned. It doesn't have to be a big thing if it's looking at a new genre in terms of the type of literature that you're consuming, or, trying to volunteer virtually. There's many ways for folks to get involved and get active. So high school itself for a lot of students, is a stressful period, right? It's stressful because there's a significant workload or course load It's stressful from a social standpoint, just because you're trying to navigate these sort of social structures and kind of the dynamics of a high school environment. It can be difficult and kind of demanding because you know what's coming, right? Kind of in 2 years' time or 4 years' time when you're getting ready for college. What are some of the things that helped you, or how did you kind of process stress during that period of your life?
Yeah, so I think, I kind of mentioned this earlier, but I was really mapping my time in high school. And the goal was that I knew that for my own mental health, I needed to be able to find time to do something for myself personally that didn't have to do with school, that I wasn't doing for my college application, but just to kind of, maintain my mental state. And so for me, it was this idea of positive stress that someone had told me about. I think I'd read maybe in a self-help book, but it had kind of talked about, stress isn't always bad. Stress can be really good. It can make you more excited, more uplifted. And so my attitude towards it was finding these opportunities that would create positive stress. And one of the things that I did in high school was I had a job. I worked at the same college prep where I attended classes. And in my household, we had a lot of conversations about, is this going to take away time from studying? Is this going to take away time from extracurriculars? And what I ended up finding was that when I was working, I was happier. I was more efficient at the work that I was doing because I was taking an hour or two every day to kind of step away from everything that drove my life at the time. And so, even when you're looking at the 2-3 year trajectory, don't just think about your academic success, think about your mental success and your mental well-being. And, it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. So work in things that are good for your mental health. And that's kind of what I did. And for me, that was going to work, a few times a week and just stepping away from the world that I was living in.
Yeah, that's a good point. So to kind of recap here, then in terms of high school, it's, if I may just summarize and correct me, but it seems like there's a few things that you tried to kind of get a handle on, right? One was time management, being able to kind of track your time, being able to understand how you allocated your time, because time is kind of, at a premium, especially at that period. And then sort of the other big thing I've sort of heard you talk about is sort of stress management and looking for activities, looking for different outlets to be able to give you sort of some escape or some sense of balance. And then kind of overall, as you talked about kind of choosing your classes and navigating the high school curriculum, you talked a little bit about sort of being a better learner, really kind of pushing your academic interests versus pushing what you think colleges may be looking for. Is that a fair summarization? Anything that I left out that you think is worth kind of capturing as part of that period of your life?
No, that's good. I mean, I think you summarize it well. The idea being that let your passions drive your grades and your application, and not the other way around. And I think if you do that, that is going to make you a happy person and a happy applicant for sure.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the college planning process, which is still, during this high school period, but it's a bit of a mind shift, right? So what were some of the experiences that you tried to pursue when it came to college planning? So things like campus visits, managing the applications. What did that look like for you?
So the whole planning process for me was always a vibrant discussion in my household. I was always thinking about where I wanted to apply, especially because I had an older sister who was already going through the process. But aside from those consistent family discussions of what am I aiming for, what is my goal, where am I going, more concretely, I think the very first thing I did that was directly college related was I went to College Expedition West the fall of my sophomore year, I believe. And that was where I really built a network of mentors that read my essays, that helped me through that, who gave me the confidence, frankly, that I needed to apply to a lot of these top tier colleges. But more importantly, the kids that went to College Expedition with me were so inspiring. They all had different interests. They were all pursuing them in different ways. And I remember I came back from College Expedition, and that was when I had actually implemented one of my extracurriculars that I had actually written about on my college application process. On my college application, I had started this bilingual basketball program after being inspired by a student at College Expedition. So I think that was a great way for me to kind of push myself and think harder about what else can I do and how else can I pursue my interests. And then also building that network of mentors who I could hop on the phone with and ask questions and get them to give me advice. So that was definitely key. The second thing I was doing was I was studying a lot for the SATs, and I started that quite early. I started maybe the summer after my freshman or sophomore year. I registered for KD College Prep. I was going to classes twice every week, and then I was taking a practice test at their center every month, and then reviewing that practice test with their instructors once a month. And that was something that was very self-driven. I had to, go to classes myself, had to get myself out of bed and do that. But my SAT score went up almost 600 points over the course of 3 years, just going to class and rigorously, committing to it. So that took up a lot of my time as well in terms of college planning. And then the last thing I did was I went on a college tour, not just to view colleges or, just to explore, but because I was really trying to decide where I wanted to early decision and if I went into early decision. So I visited 3 schools, and I ended up only applying to 2 of them because I realized I really didn't like one, and I not only didn't want to go there, I just didn't even want an early decision there. So that was really insightful for that. But I was really trying to narrow, where I wanted to apply. And I ultimately decided I didn't want early decision anywhere because I couldn't commit. But I think that trip was really critical for me to see if there was, somewhere that I loved and wanted to be, and I could maximize my chances of getting into by early decisioning.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I'm kind of monitoring some of the questions that are coming through as we're talking. So for those of you who have questions, feel free to use the chat box. If we don't get to your question during the segments of the conversation, we'll have a Q&A at the end as well. One of the analogies that I've heard with regards to test prep is, you've got sort of 2 schools of thought. You've got a school of thought, which is, go to the test prep centers or online sort of service providers who can engage you. And then there's kind of another school of thought or another camp that says, go to the library, check out books from Princeton Review or Kaplan or whoever, and then kind of, work on your own. Would you say that there's a certain kind of personality or a certain mindset that gravitates towards one versus the other?
Yeah, so I think to this point, and, also fielding kind of the questions that are in the chat box, 2 things. First, I'm not sure that there is a personality that prefers one or the other, but for me, it was I needed structure. It was the same reason I went to tutoring, was I needed someone to make me sit down for 2 hours a day and just look at my homework. And in the same way, I needed to be held accountable. I needed regular workshop timings. I needed, to have a set time for practice tests. And I needed someone to send my parents report cards saying, hey, Alena didn't show up this month for class. And I needed that. I needed that kind of structure. So for me, doing it on my own wasn't going to get me too far. I knew I was just going to sit around and stay in my comfort zone and only study the math section because that's what I was good at. And it made me feel good to look at the higher score there. So that's kind of why I started going. But on the flip side, I also would say it's a mixture, right? So you don't want to start rigorous SAT study too early because it's, like I said, it's a marathon and you're gonna burn out. And I saw this with my own brother. I had him start a year earlier than I started. And by the time it was time for him to give the test, he was like, I never want to take this test again. I hate it. So, it is a balance of, not starting too early, but starting on time, but then also doing maybe some exposure to the test before you start rigorously studying. But either way, once you decide you're studying for the SAT, come up with a routine, stick to it, whether that's in your house through test prep books. I think the prep books are great. I used a lot of them when I was studying for the ACT because I didn't take classes for the ACT. But for whatever it is, find a routine, something that works for you and your personality type, and stick to it.
Yeah, I think one of the analogies that I've heard of is when you go to the gym, sometimes people look for a personal trainer and sometimes people can sort of figure out what they want to do themselves. And so, the personal trainer is kind of the equivalent to a test center or somebody who's sort of coaching you through the process, maybe. If that's a fair analogy, I'm not sure, but it sounds like some of those elements may be similar. And somebody like me who thinks he knows what he's doing at the gym but has no idea, but would probably suit better with some prep books. So, okay, that's helpful. Let's talk a little bit about kind of the actual application strategy. So what was typically your approach when it came to the overall application, the essays, the short answers? How did you sort of think about that and navigate that?
Yeah, so I think 2 things here. Starting off, start early. Your writing skills are not going to get that much better over the summer. So start at the beginning of the summer. I started in June, right after the SAT subject tests were over. And I had pulled every question that every college was going to ask me, the Common App essay. I had pulled it all into a Google Drive folder and just had a good picture of what was expected of me throughout the application process, so I could be realistic about my timeline. That was probably the most important thing. But then on a more, theoretical level about, shaping that application, I really tried to weave a picture through my essays. So I wrote essays that were about different aspects of my life and different, things that I had done and been involved in, but they all had a common thread. And for me, that was service to others. That was kind of my theme and something that I cared a lot about. And to this day, I study in college and have pursued. But I wanted that to come across on my college application. So whether I was writing about my passion for basketball, I was fitting in the ways that I had channeled basketball through service. And, like I mentioned earlier, I'd started that bilingual basketball program where students from elementary schools played basketball with students from high school, and it was mentorship in Spanish and that sort of a program. So even when I was talking about my passion about something that is not really related to service to others, I had found a way in high school to channel it into kind of what I would say was my application theme. And as I was looking at my essays, I always tried to make sure that I could think to myself, how would an admissions officer kind of bucket my application? When they went to fight for me, they would say, we need Alena on our campus because she's going to promote this aspect of campus. And for some people that's, computer science or startups or entrepreneurial stuff, whereas for others it's medicine. But for me, it was service and policy. And so that's really what I tried to do through my essays, was try to, put a single thread through all of those essays.
Good point. Yeah. So for those of you who are following along, who may not be familiar, when it comes to the admissions process, you typically have what's called a committee, where schools will get together at the end of the reviews of the applications and the essays and come to the table and sort of say, we advocate for these students for these reasons. And it's not that they're looking at you individually, but they're looking to build a class. So they want to make sure that they have a class that's diverse across, those who are leaders, those who are involved in athletics, those who are involved in service, those who are from different parts of the country or even the world. And so kind of the thing that Alena is sort of alluding to here is, for the service bucket, or for kind of the kind of community involvement bucket, she was really kind of angling, if I'm understanding you, Alena, you were really kind of angling for that dimension, or sort of that profile that you could then sort of elevate yourself within that group or segment.
Right. And at the same time, some of my essays were just about like my interest in coffee and had nothing to do with my, it kind of added character, but my major essays, yeah, that was definitely the strategy there.
Yeah. One of the great essays that I've read is actually about a woman who walks through the Costco aisles and talks about, her curiosity of who's consuming the 256-ounce bottles of ketchup. And it's a complete departure from her own specific, experiences or activities. But to your point, about coffee, it talks about some of her curiosities, and through her story, you get to sort of really learn a lot about her, which you don't expect as you start to read the essay. So kind of the techniques and the strategies are not just, you writing in black and white, but really sort of being creative. One of the things that we also talk about in terms of Apollo 12, which is a program here in the United States, is that your application essays are your 30-second Super Bowl commercial equivalent, right? So in that period of time, what can you do to really sort of convince and compel the admissions committee to advocate for you during their decision-making process? Okay, that's really helpful. So thank you for that. So a couple of things that I heard, and you kind of talked a little bit about sort of your desire to start early, right? Whether it was the SAT, ACT prep, whether it was thinking about your essays, or even starting to visit campuses, just starting as soon as possible or as early as possible really helps you. I think for the current state that we're in, where campuses are closed, the option that many students have at this point is really to look at online virtual tours, right? There are many universities who are providing those resources available to prospective students. And so don't feel that you always have to go to a campus, especially now, but you can do a lot of information gathering in the interim before campuses come back and are reopened. The other thing that I sort of heard you talk about is kind of this unified thread, right? Sort of having kind of a profile, or kind of a way that you represented yourself. I've heard other people talk about this overarching thesis. Like, what is the thesis of your application? What are you trying to really sort of push forward? Are you the star athlete? Are you the student government, kind of lead? Or in your case, kind of being the one who is involved in community and community impact. So that's really helpful. Talk to me a little bit about kind of rejection and how one might deal with rejection. I imagine, if somebody's applying to 5 schools or 15 schools or more, not all of those will end up in one's favor. So what's advice that you have on kind of navigating that period? Because technically you can only attend one college, right? So as long as you get one acceptance, you're golden. But it's also hard when the rejections come through as they likely might.
Yeah, I had quite a few of those, so can definitely speak to that. Yeah, rejections are tough, right? Because you've kind of been banking on this, and it's disheartening. You spent a lot of time on the application. What I would say though, is that in hindsight, I say this in hindsight, I didn't know this in high school, but colleges are looking for fit, right? They want to see, like, would you fit in on our campus? So when they're rejecting you, you're also kind of rejecting them. You're saying, you're not going to be a good school for me. You're not going to be somewhere that I'm going to be happy or be able to pursue my passions. And I don't think it's you're not good enough. I think it's more of there is a better fit out there for you. And I don't think I understood this until I got into Yale. I had always wanted to go to Stanford. I didn't get into Stanford, which I know isn't shocking, but I also almost didn't get into my state school. So it was like I was juggling a lot of these weird rejections that I didn't fully understand, and I was quite disheartened. And then I got to Yale and I realized that liberal arts was the education I always needed, but just didn't have the awareness to know about, right? And so it took a bit of a mind shift, and it was definitely tough when it happened. But I think looking back at it, it was kind of a gift, right? I think I should have gone anywhere but Stanford is what I've realized looking back at it now, because it's not where I wanted to be. But I didn't know that at the time. So I think rejection can be tough, but I also don't think you should let rejection deter you. On a, kind of talking about college expedition, I didn't get into National College Expedition. And at the time, my mindset was, well, if I can't go look at these colleges, if I can't go look at Harvard, how am I supposed to apply, right? And I'd really been like, maybe I'm not good enough. I shouldn't do that. I shouldn't apply. It's a waste of my time. But I think ultimately, after talking to my family, they were like, look, you're going to write 3 essays. It's going to take you, a day, 2 days, 3 weeks, let's say. But it has the potential to change the trajectory of your life. And if you don't risk it, you're never going to know. And so I think to some extent, it's all about shooting your shot and being confident that, it's going to be a little bit of an investment, but it might work. And that should be enough to motivate you to always shoot your shot, because you have no idea what's going to work out or how the stars are going to align.
Yeah, I like the shoot your shot analogy. It's helpful visually and then kind of also figuratively. Talk a little bit about kind of, if you were to now give advice to other high school students who are in this period of their life, right? Sort of the 11th grade year where they're starting to think about colleges, starting to plot out their campus visits, et cetera. How do you advise them on the number of schools to put on their radar? Not just even the number of schools to apply to, right? But kind of even starting to identify and prioritize those schools. What would be your advice in that scenario?
Yeah, I would say create a balance of schools that you definitely know you can get into, so that you know that you are going to college, right? And then there's 3 categories, right? There's your safety schools, so schools that are within that you're going to go to. Then you have schools that are target, that are within your reach, but they're not like a definite yes, you're going to get in. And then set a range of reach schools, and those should be the ones that you're really excited about, that you maybe it's like a 1%, 2% acceptance rate, but you're gonna shoot that shot. And so that's kind of those 3 categories. And I think sometimes we get really nervous and we only stick to our, we don't do the shoot the shot, or we get overconfident and we don't do the safety schools. And I think it's more about thinking rigorously and being honest with yourself about what you want and what's attainable, and what happens if the stars align. And I think that's a good way to think about developing that college list. Also, don't make it too long, because you don't want to spend forever writing essays. So really narrow. Don't apply to schools that you don't like the environment of, or you think it's too far from Kane, if that's something that's important to you. But you balance what you're interested in with where you would get the best education and all of those sorts of things.
Yeah, I think one of the things that is critical is to build this criteria, right? So what are the things that are important to you when it comes to a college? Do you need to be in an urban center or sort of a less urban or rural, place? How far or near do you want to be from home? Do you need a national university or a liberal arts college? Do you need sort of a large sort of sports presence or not? Jamaat Khana and proximity to Jamaat Khana. So kind of building that list, as you mentioned, is definitely something that is sort of a first step, right? And then even as you sort of start to identify schools, like you said, right, you went on a road trip and sort of visited a few campuses and realized that some of those schools fell off your list after you did some research. And so sort of starting broad and then kind of using research and kind of using different tools and conversations with people who are at those schools or have gone to those schools, and, it's sort of a good way to start to narrow it down or whittle it down to then the schools that you want to ultimately apply to. So, okay, good thoughts. So let's turn a little bit now to your time at Yale. And maybe we'll just start by gaining an overarching perspective on the school. I mean, how would you describe the broad academics at Yale, student life? What's been sort of the overall experience, from a student standpoint?
Yeah, I think Yale's motto has to be that we take everything we do very seriously, but we don't take ourselves very seriously. And that's to say our academics are, like one might predict, very rigorous. We write tons and tons of papers. I've written just about 50 pages this week, and it's only Monday? So in 2 days, I've written about 50 pages, but we write a ton. And so the academics are rigorous, and because of that, it means that people really prioritize taking classes that they really care about, because no one wants to waste time writing about classes that they really just cannot stand. And that means that everyone's really passionate about whatever they study, whether that's the environment, whether that's gender, whether that's biology, whether that's chemistry. I have friends who read chemistry textbooks for fun, that's on their bookshelf. But it's because they're so passionate about whatever it is that they do. And that means that no matter who you sit down with, you're learning something new, whether that's over lunch, whether that's over dinner, just people know so much. And it makes for such an intellectual, exciting space to live in. At the same time, everyone is really chill, for lack of better words. People are really serious about their academics, but in terms of personal life, they have so many passions outside of it. I think every single person at Yale, I will say, has a friend who sings, has a friend who sings, has a friend who dances, and has a friend who's a comedian, because our arts are so lively. There's always so many shows to go to, and your friends are always in it, and it's such a blast to cheer them on. But because it's such a small school, it means you are really close to those sorts of experiences, right? So when you go to a dance show, at least 3 or 4 people in it, which is really special. And people spend a lot of time just hanging out. And for me, that's been in the pottery studio. I've spent about 10 hours a week with my friends just doing pottery, not for class, just for fun, listening to music, hanging out. But that's really kind of the vibe there, is everyone cares a lot about their academics, but then is also really has a lot of talents, has a lot of skills, and is a really good time to kind of hang out with.
That's great to hear. I'm glad you're having a positive experience so far. Tell us a little bit about your specific academic journey. I mean, what have been kind of the classes that have appealed to you? How did you go about deciding your major? Some of those areas of your path at Yale.
So deciding a major is kind of a sore subject for me, because I switched majors 5 times. In fact, that picture on the screen that says Yale Computer Science, that was taken by a class that I was taking in the department. And between the time that they took this photo and uploaded it to their Facebook, I had changed out of the CS major to the political science major. So I changed my major a ton. But really that was because I was so excited that I was going to a school that was so good at everything. Every class I took, the professor had a Wikipedia page, or had published the textbook, or eventually actually became the director of the World Bank. So, those sorts of things were so common to where I could not focus in on one subject because I was so fascinated. My freshman year, I didn't take a single class in the same subject. I was closer to a Spanish major, and that's because I took 2 classes in Spanish. So I was really, exploring and taking advantage of the fact that I was at an institution where they were good at everything. And I think because of that, I can hold a conversation about cognitive science, and I can hold a conversation about microeconomics and macroeconomics, even being a political science major. And so my strategy was really explore. And then once I'd figured out that, okay, I was really interested in policy, I was kind of gravitating the policy aspect of every class, I started focusing in on that. But at the same time, I was trying to balance, continuing to explore intellectual curiosity and gaining just knowledge for the sake of knowledge, with developing professional and technical skills that I would need to get a job in the policy world. So sometimes that meant, I was taking a class in Hindi last semester just for fun, and I was taking 4 political science classes, but 1 class in Hindi just to really deviate from my studies. But so my approach had always been, be a generalist, take a lot of classes in different subjects, and then balance professional and technical classes with just for fun, interesting classes.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, we do have, or we see students who also go to college and know exactly what they want, right? They either they want to go in and they know they want to be pre-med, or they want to be pre-law, or they want to go into engineering. I mean, what sort of advice do you have for somebody who's definitely determined to go down a certain path?
Yeah, I think kind of the same advice. Like, even if you are determined and you have a focus, which I didn't, and that's why I went to a liberal arts school, find, like, every semester, take 1 class that doesn't have anything to do with what you're studying, at the very least, because that will broaden your horizons and will tie into your classes in ways that you didn't even see happening, but will just make you a more informed person. So, don't get bogged down by your pre-med courses. Try to take a course that's completely off the track, right, off the beaten track, and you're at an institution where they teach so many subjects. Take advantage of it. You're paying for it,
Yeah. I think you mentioned something to me in an earlier conversation, that your resume now is like a coloring book, because you've just had such variety and sort of exposure. Yeah. So I love that analogy as well. Let's turn to kind of some of your extracurriculars at Yale. What are some of the things that you've pursued outside of class? You mentioned pottery. What have been some of your other interests and passions outside the classroom?
So even though I stopped pursuing computer science as a major, I was still really interested in it as an industry. So I served as the director of Yale's hackathon, YHack, 2 years ago now. And so that was a big part of my undergraduate experience. I spent a lot of time pulling off this hackathon, which is essentially this 36-hour continuous event that doesn't stop overnight, and everyone just codes for 36 hours and tries to make programs that are really impressive. And so that was something that took up a ton of my time. But at the same time, I was doing a lot of fun things, like you mentioned, the pottery studio. I cared a lot about international development. So I served on ISEC for a few months, where we were sending students to volunteer abroad. And so, in this way, it was kind of a balance between skills that were actually professional, like YHack and Yale's hackathon, but also skills that were just fun and didn't have anything to do with, wasn't going to be anything more on my resume than just a line under interests, but it was something that got me really excited, like pottery.
That's great. There's a kind of a question that came through, which I think applies both to sort of the high school realm as well as the college realm, which is, at what point do you know to go broad in your activities or your academics? And then at what point do you start to kind of really narrow, right? Is there sort of a smooth transition from one to the other? Or, is it sort of time driven that you've got to decide either academically or extracurriculars, if you have a view on that?
Yeah, I think you should start broad, right? That's always a good starting point. I think you should narrow as soon as you have lost interest in other things. So at one point, something's going to be a front runner. Something's going to make you excited about getting out of bed every morning. And sometimes I think we wait too long to make the jump because we want to maintain the broadness and and there's something that we're a little bit interested in, but we don't want to let go of. That was really, especially when I was trying to narrow my majors, right? That was really hard for me because I cared a lot about computer science, but I also cared a lot about political science, and I couldn't do both. And so, but I think as soon as you know that the conversation, the extracurriculars that you love talking about the most And then also the extracurriculars that you have the most potential in. You quite early figure out if you're a dancer or you're not, right? Like I quite early knew I wasn't going to be a basketball player. So as soon as you know, even if it's something that you're excited about, let it go and find other more recreational ways to stay involved in those sorts of things. But definitely don't take too long, because I think it does make it hard to sharpen those skills and really make it a niche if you're too broad for too long. I still consider myself a generalist, but under the umbrella of a policy now, which is some sort of a niche, right? So I don't think it has to be super focused, but I do think you should, choose pretty early on.
Okay, that's fair. So one question before we turn it over to the Q&A, and we've been sort of monitoring the chat box here, so I think we've covered a good number of the questions that have come through, but we'll see kind of what else is out there. But a question before we turn to that is, on a few occasions during the recent Diamond Jubilee, Maulana Hazri Imam touched on the purpose of education. So, kind of to help you, or kind of to encourage you to reflect on that, what would you say is the purpose of your education? And I'm sure it will evolve over the course of your journey, but sort of today, May 2020, what would you sort of think of your purpose to be?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, I think if I look back at it in retrospect, I think my purpose has kind of always been the same. I mean, ever since we were little, being first-gen immigrant family, my parents had always talked about how education was the one way that you could help pull others out of poverty. And growing up, for me and my sister and my brother, education had always been the sort of superpower, right? Like as little kids, we had viewed it as, if I get education, I can literally be helping the world. Like, I know that's a naive thought, but as a child, it was the only way for us to kind of operationalize this really broad idea of like helping the world, right? And so for me, it's always been that education is this sort of superpower that helps us understand the experiences that those around us are having so that we can then help them, right? And this is something that now that I've matured from the world of superpowers, Hazri Imam talks about this, right? When he talks about the empathy gap, and I encourage people to read his Ogden lecture as a refresher, but he talks about this idea of the empathy gap, where the knowledge gap to him is concerning because it creates this empathy gap where if we don't know the experiences that the people around us in the world are having, we can't help them, right? And if we don't know the tools to help them, then we definitely can't help them. So for me, that's been the driving force of my education, is that I want to close that empathy gap for myself, so that whether I'm, a stakeholder at a business or I'm working on Capitol Hill, that I'm thinking about those voices that are not in the room, that aren't represented. And for me, that's the goal of education is, how do I bring people into the conversation who don't have the means to be in those conversations? And so, that's really what's shaped, I think, my future goals and my current academic goals as well.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So thank you for all those insights and perspectives. Just looking to kind of turn to Q&A now. If you have a question that hasn't been answered, please feel free to add that to the chat box, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. I know we're at the hour. One question that I did see come through is sort of the role of parents and families in your life. We do have a number of parents and guardians that are listening here. So curious to sort of hear from you, what role you think family played in your kind of upbringing, sort of during your high school journey as you grappled with so many different decisions and opportunities, and then even through college. I mean, you talked a little bit about changing your major 5 times, and some of those things probably caused some consternation around the dinner table. So would love to just kind of get your overall thoughts on how families played a role in your life, and then kind of, how other families can play a role in the lives of their students.
Yeah, so I think for me, my parents and my siblings and even my mentors have always believed in me, I think, more than I believed in myself. And I think that is what really drove me. Like, my mom was convinced that I could get into any college that I could apply to. That is false. Post-college application season, we know that now. But I think it was more of that motherly, support. Like, I think in the back of her mind, she was like, there's no way in heck she's getting into half these colleges. But to me, she never let me know that. And to me, she was always like, no, you can do this. Like, and it was about having those frequent conversations that really normalized it for me. We would talk about at the dinner table, like, what do you want going forward? And they would talk to me a lot about what is, you know, something that I prioritize, what I want out of my education. And I think having those conversations is really important for just the mindset of the college application process. But I've always had, my parents have always been very supportive of whatever it was that I wanted to do. So even when I, you know, was changing majors 5 times, my parents were never asking me like, what's your major? Like sometimes they would just ask me when some family member asked like, oh, what's Alena studying? They'd be like, oh, what are you studying again? Like, because I just changed majors so much. And at the end of the day, they put their trust in me that I was going to graduate and that I was going to figure it out and find a way to be successful. But the only piece of advice I think they really pushed on was no matter what you choose, be the best. And I think this for me is more relevant for my sister than me because she switched from pre-med to journalism, second year of college, which was absolutely jarring. They're so different. And she became a really successful journalist. And that's all they cared about was, you know, whatever you do, be successful at it. And that's what matters to us, and be the best. So that was an ask that I was like, I can strive for that. Can't tell you what my major is, but I can strive to be the best.
That's fantastic. There's a question that's come through around, you know, students who are in middle school, obviously still far away from college planning or the college journey, but what are some things that students can do at that point? You know, how can families support their interests? What advice do you have? What do you have for that segment of the Jamaat?
Yeah, I think this is, you know, going back to that question you asked me earlier about broad versus specific extracurriculars, this is the time to explore. Like middle school is the time to explore. If kids want to try out for the dance team and have never done it before, let them. I had never played basketball a day in my life before I was at gym class. They were like, shoot a jump shot. You're trying out for the basketball team because we all had to. And I made the team and that's what started my basketball career. And like, I'd never touched the basketball, didn't know what a sideline was, didn't even know the rules of the game, but just had been put into it. And I think for middle school, I think that kind of generalizes, right? Like there's a lot of things that kids want to try that they're not super committed to, but they want to explore, and let them. Like if they want to take an art class, let them do it. But encourage them to, you know, to have those conversations about, hey, like, how do you feel about this? Like, are you actually interested in this? Or, you know, do you want to do some more with this? Do you want to sign up for actual classes? But I think that's the best way to support is to just let them explore, let them run free, even if you don't fully understand it.
Yeah, it's fantastic. There's a question in the chat box around scholarships and financial aid. Any advice as to when students should start thinking about those things? How does that play a role in one's college decision?
Yeah, so I think I think you should start thinking about it early is what I would say. A lot throughout high school, there are a lot of scholarships online that you can apply for. It's honestly using the same essays that you're writing for college, just recycling them. But there's scholarships for people who are left-handed, scholarships for people who are short, people who are tall. Like there's all of that out there, and you can start applying for that throughout high school. Where I found the most success though was my high school and my city had a range of scholarships that the Rotary Club offered, that the Women's Club offered. And I applied for all of those and had a lot more success there than I did in some of the bigger national scholarship programs. But also I think AKEB, and maybe you can speak more to this, has, you know, that 50-50 scholarship grant program as well. So those are realistic options to consider. Insofar as how much of a role that should play in the college that you decide, my personal belief is that you can get a return on investment, right? Like you can get a good job, you can get a return on investment, but this is an investment you make for 4 years that has a payout for 80 something years or however long you live, hopefully longer than that. And so in the grand scheme of your life, it's a very small amount of investment that you'll be making. And I think I think that's how you should think about it, that it's not an investment for the short term, it's an investment for the long term.
Yeah, that's a good point. I know, you know, many leading schools have come out with some clear statements around cost of attendance. So, you know, Yale has put something on their website that says, if you get accepted to our school, we will do everything possible to make sure you can actually walk on campus, right? Harvard has come out and said that in 95% of cases, we are actually cheaper than your state school. And so I think sometimes there's this intimidation that families feel we can't afford these schools, so we probably shouldn't even consider applying to them. But to your point earlier, you've got to shoot your shot, right? If you get in and you still can't afford it after all the financial aid and scholarships, then you make those decisions at that point. But if you make the decision even before you apply, you're sort of preempting yourself and not shooting your shot, right?
And so let me say one more sentence here. a lot of college websites have the financial aid calculator, right? Where you can plug in your information and they'll tell you how much it's going to cost. And you're right, a lot of times it does end up being cheaper than state school. And I've seen that a lot. I've seen that happen a lot. So if that really shouldn't be something that should hold you back. I know Yale even recently bumped their requirement down from like they used to cover everyone who was under 100,000, but I think they've moved that to 70,000 now. So you're making under 70,000 to cover everyone, which a lot of colleges have policies that change, are really dynamic. So definitely use those financial aid calculators to get an idea of how much things are going to cost you. But at the end of the day, like I said, the return on investment, it's a long-term investment.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So I think we've gotten to a lot of the broad questions that would be of general interest here. I see some specific questions that have come up, Alena, so maybe we'll follow up with these individuals one-on-one. If you haven't been able to submit your question through the chat box, or if you have a thought, after this session today, please reach out to us and we'll get you connected with Alena and others on our team who can provide some support. And that email address is akeb@theismailiusa.org. And just if you can include the subject line Luminaries question or something to that effect, we can make sure that we can get to you as soon as possible. Alena, I'd like to give you an opportunity to share any parting thoughts or any advice that you have that you'd like to leave students and their families with in Arjuna.
Yeah, I think so. This kind of goes to the conversation that we were just having about making the most of your education and that investment that you're making. But this was something that really drove me when I was weighing my options, because I was also considering a full scholarship to another liberal arts school and Yale. And so for me, what really got to me were these two quotes, and that's why I've listed them here. I won't read them, but I encourage you to take a screenshot and kind of read it later. But the really important thing when you're weighing your options is to think really deeply about what university is going to make you the best, not today, not tomorrow, but 10 years from now, when the economy is different, when the knowledge society that Hazarmam talks so deeply about is different, right? Hazarmam says that you're going to be moving through 2 or 3 careers. That's just how things work now. And so what is going to make you the most able to move through those careers? And what is going to teach you how to learn more quickly, right? And so not just learn about one subject, but how do you learn about anything, really? And that's what college should teach you. And so I think, when you're trying to make these decisions, think about that. And I think this is a prime example of this with coronavirus, where, really the economy has been uprooted and a lot of people just haven't made it. And the people who make it are the ones who really invested in their education and are resilient and flexible and dynamic in the workforce, in their own lives as citizens, who are able to, move on and move forward and pick themselves back up. And so that's kind of, if I had one parting idea, it would be don't hold yourself back. Shoot your shot, take the risk, make the investment, because it has the potential to change the trajectory of your life forever. It's 4 years of, going through college and paying for it, 4 years of high school, writing college applications and writing essays, but in the span of your life, that's such a small portion.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Alena. This has been really, really insightful and great pieces of advice, great reflections. I feel like I can probably write your autobiography or your biography, I guess, or maybe we can tag team on that, because I feel like all of us have learned so much about you. So appreciate you allowing us into that, to look into that window of your life. Just a few housekeeping matters before we wrap up. So as I mentioned at the start of the conversation, we've got 2 more sessions coming up as part of this series. Next Monday, May 11th, we'll be meeting Arman Ismail, who's a student at the University of California, Berkeley. And then Monday, May 18th, we'll be meeting Insha Magnogia at Vanderbilt University. If you are interested in either or both of those conversations, you will have to register separately for each one. So for Arman, you can register at tinyurl.com/springep2. And to learn more about Insha Magnogia and her journey, you can register at tinyurl.com/springep3. In addition to that, if you know a college student or you yourself are a college student and you'd like to be featured as a future luminary, we are accepting nominations. And so you can go to tinyurl.com/Apollo nomination and submit some basic information there. If you are a current 11th grade student here in the United States and you are just starting your college journey or college application journey, I should say, we have a program here in the States called Apollo 12, where we're working with 11th grade students now to get them started on this process, everything from identifying schools to prioritizing schools to thinking about your essays and even preparing for interviews and getting recommendation letters in. We'll walk you through that entire journey, and we have advisors who are available to be able to support you through that. So if you're interested in participating, this is open to all current 11th graders. You can go to tinyurl.com/Apollo advising, and we'll be in touch with you there. As I mentioned, sorry, I'll leave the screen up just so you can capture this information if you need it. In conclusion, Alena, we'd like to thank you for your time and the wisdom that you shared with us. We also would like to thank all the participants who carved out part of their evening to join us here. We hope you take away a few thoughts from this session, and we look forward to our next discussion next Monday with Arman Ismail. We'll also be sending out a short survey at the end of this session, just so that we can gather some feedback in order to make these future opportunities more relevant and sort of more applicable to your interests. Thank you all again. We hope you stay safe and stay healthy. Yeah, Alena,